The morning sun rose over the farm and cast long shadows across the dry soil. Margaret Chen wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked at the fields that stretched before her. The land was hard and unforgiving, much like everything else on New Haven since her husband died 3 years ago. She gripped the handle of her farming tool tighter and continued working the earth, knowing that every seed she planted might mean the difference between eating and starving through the next winter. Her son Danny was 12 years old now and already doing the work of a grown man. She could see him near the edge of their property, checking the fence line that separated their farm from the vast forest beyond. The deep-wood forest stretched for thousands of miles in every direction, a dark and mysterious place that no colonist had ever fully explored. The trees there grew taller than any building in the settlement, their tops disappearing into the clouds on misty mornings. Margaret's husband had been a colonial ranger, one of the brave men who protected the settlement from the dangerous wildlife that sometimes emerged from the wilderness. He died defending their home, and the colony gave her a medal and some empty words of gratitude. The medal sat in a drawer somewhere, gathering dust, while she struggled every day to keep their farm running and food on the table. The colony of New Haven had been established 70 years ago by humans seeking a fresh start on a new world. The planet was beautiful but harsh, with soil that needed constant attention and weather that could turn deadly without warning. Still, the colonists persevered, building their settlement and slowly expanding their territory. Margaret's farm sat on the very edge of that expansion, the last piece of civilization before the wild forest took over. Vincent Gray had been coming around more frequently lately. He was the colonial administrator, a man with smooth words and cold eyes who always dressed too fancy for a frontier world. He wanted her land. He said the colony needed to expand, that the logging operations required access to the forest edge, and that her small farm was standing in the way of progress. He offered her money at first, enough to buy a smaller place closer to the settlement center. When she refused, his offers became threats. Margaret knew what her husband would have wanted. He loved this land. He built their home with his own hands, planted the first crops, and dreamed of the day when Danny would inherit a prosperous farm. She would not abandon that dream, not for all the money Vincent Gray could offer, and certainly not because of his threats. Danny came running across the field, his boots kicking up dust. He was a thin boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined eyes. He had grown up quickly after losing his father, taking on responsibilities that most children his age never had to consider. He spent his free time exploring the forest edge, learning to hunt small game and studying the plants that grew in the shadow of the great trees. Margaret worried about him going too close to the deep wood, but she also knew that the food he brought back helped them survive. "Mama, there are men coming," Danny said, breathing hard from his run. 3 of them on hoverbikes, and they're headed this way. Margaret felt her stomach tighten. She knew who they were. Vincent Gray's enforcers, Carl Hudson, Pete Morrison, and Jake Sullivan. They were the men who did Gray's dirty work, the ones who made sure that people who refused his offers eventually changed their minds. She had heard stories about other farmers who stood against the administrator, and none of those stories ended well. "Go inside and stay there," Margaret told her son. "No matter what happens, you stay inside until I tell you it's safe." Danny's face showed fear, but also the stubborn determination he inherited from both his parents. "I can help you, Mama. I'm not afraid of them." "I know you're not afraid," Margaret said, placing her hand on his shoulder. "But I need you to be smart right now, not brave. Please, Danny, do as I say." The boy reluctantly headed toward their small house while Margaret walked to the equipment shed. She kept her husband's old shotgun there, loaded and ready. She had hoped never to need it, but hope was a luxury she could no longer afford. The sound of hoverbike engines grew louder as she emerged from the shed with the weapon in her hands. The 3 men pulled up in front of her house, killing their engines and climbing off their bikes with the casual confidence of people who believed they held all the power. Carl Hudson was the biggest of them, a man with thick arms and a cruel smile. Pete Morrison was tall and thin with nervous eyes that never stayed still. Jake Sullivan was the youngest, barely 20, but already he had the hard look of someone who enjoyed hurting others. "Mrs. Chen," Carl said, his voice carrying false friendliness, "Mr. Gray sent us to have a conversation with you. He's been very patient, but his patience has limits. We're here to make sure you understand how serious he is about acquiring your property." Margaret raised the shotgun and pointed it directly at Carl's chest. Her hands were steady despite the fear racing through her veins. You can tell Mr. Gray that my answer is the same as it's always been. This is my land and I'm not leaving. Pete laughed, a high-pitched sound that grated on Margaret's nerves. You think that old gun scares us, lady? We've got stunners, communication equipment, and the full authority of the colonial administration behind us. You've got nothing but dirt and stubbornness. I've got the law on my side, Margaret said. This land was legally granted to my husband for his service. You have no right to force me off it. Jake stepped forward, his hand moving toward the stunner at his belt. The law is whatever Mr. Gray says it is out here on the frontier. Now you can make this easy and sign the transfer papers, or we can make it difficult. Your choice. Margaret's finger moved to the trigger. She had never shot another person in her life, but she would do it to protect her home and her son. The three men saw the determination in her eyes and hesitated. For a moment, everything hung in balance, violence just one wrong word away from exploding into reality. Then smoke began pouring from the barn. Margaret turned her head toward the barn and saw flames beginning to lick up the wooden walls. Her heart dropped into her stomach. The hay storage was in there, along with feed for their few animals and tools they could not afford to replace. More importantly, Danny was supposed to be in the house, but she knew immediately what he had done. Her brave, foolish boy had created a distraction to help her. Carl and his men were momentarily confused by the fire. Their attention split between Margaret and the growing blaze. That moment of confusion was all Danny needed. He burst from behind the barn, already running at full speed toward the tree line of the deep wood forest. His small form moved quickly across the open ground, and Margaret's shout of alarm caught in her throat. "The boy!" Jake yelled, pointing toward Danny's fleeing figure. He set the fire. Pete was already moving back to his hover bike. Little punk is going to pay for that. Nobody burns down property that belongs to Mr. Gray. That property doesn't belong to Gray, Margaret screamed. But her words were lost in the roar of hoverbike engines starting up. All three men mounted their bikes and took off after Danny, leaving Margaret standing with her useless shotgun as her son disappeared into the forest with three dangerous men chasing him. She started to run after them, but her legs felt like lead and the hoverbikes moved far faster than she ever could. The forest swallowed them all within seconds, and Margaret was left standing at the edge of her burning barn, torn between fighting the fire and chasing after her son. Tears streamed down her face as she realized she could do neither effectively. Another engine sound made her turn. Vincent Gray's personal transport was approaching, a sleek vehicle that looked out of place on the rough frontier. The administrator stepped out, his expression showing false concern as he surveyed the burning barn and Margaret's desperate state. "What a terrible accident," Gray said, his voice smooth as oil. "It seems your barn has caught fire. My men were just here trying to have a reasonable conversation with you when your son apparently decided to commit arson and flee into the forest. Very unfortunate. Very unfortunate indeed." Margaret raised the shotgun again, this time pointing it at Gray's face. "Call them back. Call your men back right now, or I swear I'll pull this trigger." Gray didn't even flinch. Two more men had emerged from his transport, both armed and both moving to flank Margaret. She was surrounded and outgunned, and the administrator knew it. He smiled that cold smile of his and shook his head slowly. "Mrs. Chen, threatening a colonial official is a serious crime. I could have you arrested right now. However, I'm willing to overlook your emotional state given the circumstances. Your son is in danger in that forest. Everyone knows the deep wood is no place for a child. Wild animals, poisonous plants, treacherous terrain. My men will find him and bring him back safely. You have my word on that." "Your word is worthless," Margaret spat. "Your men are going to hurt him. I know what kind of people they are." Gray's expression hardened. "My men are professionals who follow orders. They will retrieve your son unharmed and bring him back here, where we can discuss his crime of arson and your continued refusal to see reason about your property situation. Now I suggest you lower that weapon before someone gets hurt. My associates here are very well trained, and they won't hesitate to defend me if you make a threatening move." Margaret knew she was beaten. The shotgun slowly lowered, and Gray's men quickly moved forward to take it from her hands. She felt hollow inside, helpless and afraid for Danny's life. The barn continued to burn behind her, but she no longer cared about it. Her entire world had narrowed to one thought. Her son was alone in the forest with three violent men chasing him. "There now," Gray said, his false friendliness returning. "That's much better. Why don't you sit down and let my associates keep you company while we wait for news? I'm sure your boy will be back soon, and then we can all have a calm, rational discussion about the future." In the forest, Danny ran like he had never run before. His heart pounded in his chest and his breath came in ragged gasps, but he didn't slow down. He could hear the hover bikes behind him, their engines snarling through the trees. The men were shouting to each other, coordinating their search, trying to cut off his escape routes. Danny knew these woods better than most colonists. He had spent countless hours exploring the forest edge, learning the paths and hiding spots that only a curious child would discover. But he had never gone this deep before. His mother always warned him about going too far, about the dangers that lurked in the unexplored wilderness. Now he had no choice. Behind him was certain capture and whatever punishment Gray's men would inflict. Ahead was the unknown, but at least it offered a chance. The trees grew larger as he ran deeper. The ones near the settlement were already impressive, but these were giants that made those look like saplings. Their trunks were as wide as houses, their bark rough and ancient. The light filtering through their leaves had a strange green quality that made everything look slightly unreal. Danny noticed other changes too. The air felt different here, cleaner somehow, but also charged with something he couldn't name. The sounds of the forest were different. Birds calling with unfamiliar songs, insects buzzing with odd rhythms. Carl's voice echoed through the trees behind him. "You can't run forever, kid. This forest goes on forever and we've got all day. Make it easy on yourself and come out now. We just want to talk." Danny knew that was a lie. He had seen the anger in their eyes when the barn caught fire. They weren't going to talk to him. They were going to hurt him and drag him back to face whatever Gray had planned. He pushed himself harder, jumping over fallen logs and dodging between massive roots that rose from the ground like walls. Pete's voice came from somewhere to his left. "Got tracks here?" "Little punk went this way," Jake answered from the right. "I'm cutting around." "We'll box him in." The hoverbikes were having trouble with the terrain now. The trees were too close together and the undergrowth too thick. Danny heard the engines rev and sputter, the men cursing as they tried to navigate through obstacles designed by nature rather than colonial engineers. That gave him hope. On foot, he might actually have a chance. Danny's legs burned with exhaustion, but fear kept pushing him forward. He had been running for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 30 minutes. The sounds of the hoverbikes had changed from aggressive snarling to frustrated whining as the machines struggled with terrain they were never designed to handle. Several times he heard crashes and curses as one of the men hit a tree or got stuck in thick underbrush. The forest had become a different world. The trees here were beyond enormous, their trunks rising like living skyscrapers into a canopy so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight reached the forest floor. Strange plants grew in the shadows, some with leaves that glowed faintly with their own light. Danny had never seen anything like them in all his explorations near the settlement. He was truly in unknown territory now, and part of his mind screamed at him to turn back, but the voices of the men behind him kept him moving forward. Pete Morrison climbed off his hoverbike and kicked it in frustration. The front stabilizer was bent from hitting a concealed root, and the engine was making a grinding noise that meant it wouldn't go much further. "This is insane," he shouted to Carl and Jake. "We're miles into the forest now. Nobody comes out this far. We should head back and tell Gray the kid ran away. He'll die out here on his own anyway." Carl Hudson shook his head, his face red with anger and exertion. "We're not going back empty-handed. Gray will have our heads if we don't bring that boy back. Besides, he's just a kid. How far could he really get?" Jake Sullivan was studying his tracking device with a confused expression. "Something's wrong with the equipment. The readings don't make sense anymore. It's like there's interference, but there's nothing out here that should cause that." "Forget the fancy gadgets," Carl said. "We can track him the old-fashioned way. Look for broken branches and footprints. He's tired and scared. He'll make mistakes." The three men abandoned their hoverbikes and continued on foot, weapons drawn. They spread out to cover more ground but stayed within shouting distance of each other. The forest seemed to close in around them, oppressive and watchful. Pete kept glancing up at the massive trees, feeling like something was watching them from the shadows. But every time he looked directly at a spot, there was nothing there. Danny stumbled and fell, catching himself on his hands. His palms scraped against rough bark and he bit his lip to keep from crying out. He couldn't let them hear him. He pulled himself up and leaned against a tree that was so wide it would take 20 people holding hands to circle it. That's when he noticed the markings. They were carved into the bark about 6 feet up, weathered and old, but definitely artificial. They looked like symbols, though Danny couldn't read what they meant. He ran his fingers over them and felt a chill run down his spine. Someone had made these marks, and they had made them a long time ago. But the colony was only 70 years old, and nobody had ever mentioned exploring this deep into the deep wood. So who carved these symbols? He looked around more carefully and saw other signs that made his breath catch. There were structures in the trees, camouflaged so perfectly that they blended with the natural wood and leaves. They were high up, built into the massive branches, and they were clearly made by intelligent hands. Platforms, bridges, buildings that merged so seamlessly with the forest that you could stare right at them and not realize what you were seeing. Danny's mind raced with questions. Were there people living out here? Had some colonists left the settlement and built a hidden community? But the structures looked old, much older than 70 years. The weathering on the wood, the way plants had grown over parts of the construction, it all suggested these had been here for a very long time. A sound made him freeze. Not the voices of the men chasing him, but something else. Movement in the canopy above. He looked up but saw nothing except leaves and branches. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched by eyes far more aware than those of his pursuers. Carl's voice rang out much closer than Danny expected. I found more tracks. The kid came through here recently. He can't be far now. Danny moved away from the marked tree and continued deeper into the forest. He no longer had any idea how to get back to the settlement. He was completely lost, but going back meant facing Gray's men, so he had no choice but to keep moving forward into this strange part of the forest where nothing made sense anymore. Jake emerged from behind a cluster of glowing plants and spotted Danny in the distance. There he is, he yelled. I see him. All three men converged on Danny's position, moving faster now that they had visual contact. Danny ran again, his tired legs protesting every step. He weaved between the giant trees, trying to use their massive trunks for cover. His vision was starting to blur from exhaustion and fear. He couldn't keep this up much longer. The ground began to slope upward, becoming rocky and difficult. Danny climbed over boulders and scrambled up steep sections, using roots and vines to pull himself higher. Behind him, the men were closing in. They were bigger and stronger, less tired because they hadn't been running as long. Pete was actually laughing now, a cruel sound that echoed through the trees. End of the line, kid, Pete called out. There's nowhere left to run. Danny reached the top of a rocky rise and found himself facing a cliff wall. The stone rose straight up for hundreds of feet, impossible to climb. To his left and right, the cliff extended as far as he could see. He had literally run himself into a corner. He turned to face the three men who were now climbing up behind him, their faces showing ugly triumph. Carl raised his stunner and pointed it at Danny. That was a good run, boy, but it's over now. Mr. Gray is going to be very interested in having a conversation with you about that barn you burned down. The forest exploded with light. Brilliant beams blazed from dozens of hidden positions in the trees on the cliff face from the ground itself. The three men spun around in confusion and sudden fear, their eyes trying to adjust to the blinding illumination. Their weapons came up instinctively, but they had no targets. The light was everywhere and nowhere, revealing nothing but shadows and leaves. Then a voice cut through the air, amplified and carrying absolute authority. Drop your weapons immediately. You are surrounded. Any aggressive action will be met with force. This is your only warning. Carl's head swiveled as he tried to locate the source of the voice. Who are you? Show yourselves, the forest answered. Figures emerged from concealment so perfect that they seemed to materialize out of thin air. They wore adaptive camouflage that had rendered them completely invisible moments before, technology that shifted and changed to match their surroundings. Now they allowed themselves to be seen, and there were dozens of them. They carried weapons that looked far more advanced than anything the colonists possessed, and they moved with the precision of highly trained soldiers. Pete's hands were shaking as he looked around at the armed figures surrounding them. This isn't possible. There's nobody out here. The forest is empty. The forest has never been empty, the amplified voice said. You simply didn't know how to look. Drop your weapons now, or we will take them from you. Jake was young enough to still have foolish bravery. He raised his stunner toward the nearest figure. We're colonial enforcers. We have the authority of the administration. You have no right to interfere with official business. The response was immediate. One of the figures raised their weapon and fired a beam of concentrated energy that struck Jake's stunner. The device exploded in his hand with enough force to knock him backward. He landed hard on the ground, his hand burned but not seriously injured. The message was clear. They could have hurt him much worse if they had wanted to. Carl and Pete dropped their weapons immediately, their hands raised in surrender. Carl's face had gone pale. Okay. We're not looking for trouble. Just let us take the kid and go, and we'll forget this ever happened. Elder Franklin Hayes stepped forward from between the trees. He was flanked by two peacekeepers, both armed and alert. Franklin himself carried no weapon, but his presence commanded respect in ways that weapons never could. He was dressed simply in clothes that looked like they were woven from the forest itself, natural fibers and earth tones that allowed him to blend with his surroundings. His face was weathered but strong, and his eyes held the kind of wisdom that came from decades of leadership and difficult decisions. "You will not be taking the child anywhere," Franklin said, his voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "You are on kindred land. You have been since you crossed the boundary 3 miles back. Here your colonial authority means nothing. Here there are different laws and you have broken them." "Kindred?" Pete's voice cracked. "What are you talking about? There's nobody on this planet but the colonists. We were the first humans to settle New Haven." Franklin smiled, but it was not a friendly expression. "You were the second. My people came to this world 500 years ago, fleeing a war that nearly destroyed Earth. We've been here ever since, watching, documenting, and staying hidden. Until today, we chose not to reveal ourselves. But we will not stand by while a child is hunted and threatened on our land." He turned his attention to Danny, who was still pressed against the cliff wall, his eyes wide with shock and confusion. Franklin's expression softened as he approached the boy slowly, careful not to frighten him further. He knelt down so they were at eye level, his movements gentle and unthreatening. "Hello, Danny," Franklin said quietly. "My name is Franklin Hayes. You're safe now. Nobody's going to hurt you. We're going to take you home to your mother. You have my word on that." Danny's voice trembled as he spoke. "How do you know my name?" "We've been watching your farm for some time. We know what the colonial administrator has been trying to do to your mother. We know that you're a good boy who loves his family and was trying to protect them. You did nothing wrong, Danny. What happened today was not your fault." Tears started running down Danny's face, the fear and exhaustion finally overwhelming him. Franklin reached out slowly and put a hand on the boy's shoulder, a simple gesture of comfort and protection. Danny didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned into that touch, desperate for any kindness after hours of terror. Lisa Webb approached with a medical scanner, running it over Danny to check for injuries. "He's dehydrated and exhausted, but nothing serious. He'll be fine once he gets some water and rest." One of the peacekeepers handed Franklin a canteen. He opened it and offered it to Danny, who drank deeply, the cool water soothing his parched throat. The boy looked around at all the armed figures, at the technology that seemed like something from a dream, at the elder who was treating him with gentle respect. "Are you soldiers?" Danny asked between drinks. "We're peacekeepers," Franklin answered. "We protect our people and our land. We try not to hurt anyone if we can avoid it, but we will defend what's ours and what's right." Carl had been watching this exchange with growing dread. He understood enough to know that they had stumbled into something far beyond their understanding. These weren't colonists. They weren't some small group of settlers who had broken away from the main settlement. This was a hidden civilization with technology and resources that made the colonial administration look primitive by comparison. "Look, there's been a misunderstanding," Carl said, his voice taking on a pleading tone. "We didn't know anyone lived out here. We were just doing our jobs. If you let us go, we won't tell anyone about you. We'll keep your secret." Franklin stood up and turned to face the three men with an expression that could have been carved from stone. "Your jobs involved threatening a widow and chasing her child through dangerous forest with the intent to harm him. You serve an administrator who uses intimidation and violence to steal land from people who cannot defend themselves. You are not victims of misunderstanding. You are enforcers of injustice." He gestured to his peacekeepers. "Secure them. They're coming with us. The colonial administrator will want to know what happened to his men, and I'm going to tell him personally." The peacekeepers moved forward and bound the three men's hands with restraints that looked like simple cord, but were impossible to break. Jake tried to struggle, but one of the peacekeepers simply looked at him and shook his head. The young enforcer went still, finally understanding that resistance was pointless. Franklin turned back to Danny and held out his hand. Come on, son. Let's get you home to your mother. She's very worried about you. The kindred emerged from the deep wood forest in the late afternoon, and the sight stopped every colonist who saw them. 50 armed peacekeepers in advanced combat gear, moving in perfect formation, escorting 3 bound prisoners and 1 young boy. At their head walked Elder Franklin Hayes, unarmed but radiating an authority that made people instinctively step back and stare. The word spread through the settlement faster than wildfire. Within minutes, hundreds of colonists had gathered in the central square, drawn by rumors of strangers emerging from the forest, of technology beyond anything they possessed, of a hidden civilization that had been watching them for decades. They lined the streets as the procession passed, their faces showing shock, fear, wonder, and confusion. Margaret Chen was waiting at the edge of the square, held back by 2 of Gray's remaining security officers but straining against their grip. When she saw Danny walking safely beside the strange old man, she cried out and broke free, running toward her son. Franklin nodded to his peacekeepers and they let her pass. Mother and son collided in a desperate embrace, both of them crying. Margaret running her hands over Danny's face and hair to convince herself he was really there and unhurt. I thought I'd lost you, Margaret sobbed. I thought those men would kill you. I'm okay, Mama, Danny said, his voice muffled against her shoulder. These people saved me. They protected me from Gray's men. Franklin waited patiently while the reunion played out, then stepped forward and spoke gently. Mrs. Chen, my name is Franklin Hayes. I'm the leader of the kindred people. Your son is safe and unharmed. We've brought him home to you, along with the men who chased him into our forest. Margaret looked up at Franklin with tears still streaming down her face, but her expression showed gratitude mixed with confusion. Thank you for protecting him. I don't understand what's happening, but thank you. Who are you? Where did you come from? Before Franklin could answer, Vincent Gray pushed through the crowd with a dozen armed security officers at his back. The colonial administrator's face was red with anger, but Danny could see fear in his eyes too. Gray had built his power on being the biggest threat in the settlement, but now he was faced with something that made him look small and weak. This is an unauthorized military force entering colonial territory, Gray announced loudly, playing to the crowd. I am the duly appointed administrator of this settlement, and I demand you identify yourselves and explain your presence here. Franklin turned to face Gray with an expression of calm disdain. We are the kindred, the original human settlers of this world. We've lived in the deep wood forest for 500 years, long before your colony was even conceived. As for our presence here, we're returning your enforcers who committed assault, trespassing, and attempted harm against a child on our sovereign land. The crowd murmured at this revelation, shock rippling through hundreds of colonists who had believed they were alone on New Haven. Gray's face went through several expressions before settling on aggressive denial. That's impossible. The colonial records show this planet was uninhabited when our settlement arrived. You're lying. Lisa Webb stepped forward and activated a holographic projector built into her wrist device. Images appeared in the air above the crowd, visible to everyone. They showed the kindred city in the forest, documented proof of settlement going back 5 centuries. They showed legal documents filed with Earth's old colonial charter authority, predating the current settlement by hundreds of years. They showed surveillance footage of the colonial settlement's establishment and growth, proving the kindred had been watching the entire time. We have no reason to lie, Lisa said clearly. We've remained hidden by choice, not necessity. We chose isolation because we wanted peace. But we will not remain hidden while injustice occurs on our doorstep. Franklin manipulated his own device and new images appeared. These showed events from that very morning. Gray's men confronting Margaret, threatening her, chasing Danny into the forest. They showed Carl raising his weapon to shoot an exhausted, frightened child. The images were clear, undeniable, and damning. Your administrator has been conducting a campaign of intimidation and violence against citizens who refuse to sell their land, Franklin said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square. He's used threats, bribery, and now attempted harm against a minor to achieve his goals. We've documented 73 separate incidents over the past 2 years. Today's events were simply the most egregious example. The crowd's murmur grew louder, angry now. Many colonists had suspected Gray of corruption, but they had no proof and no power to challenge him. Now outsiders were providing that proof and the evidence was undeniable. People who had lost land to Gray's schemes looked at the holographic evidence with growing fury. People who had been threatened or intimidated saw validation of their experiences. Gray tried to regain control of the situation. Whatever my men may have done, they were acting on colonial authority. This is an internal matter. You have no jurisdiction here. Franklin's expression hardened. You're wrong on several counts. First, you have no colonial authority over kindred land, which begins 3 miles into the forest. Your men crossed that boundary in pursuit of a child, making them criminals under our law. Second, we filed claim to this entire continent with the original Earth Colonial Charter Authority. Your settlement exists here only because we chose not to contest your presence when you arrived. He stepped closer to Gray, and the administrator instinctively backed up. Third, and most importantly, we have evidence of your crimes. Not just today's assault, but years of corruption, bribery, and violence. We've been documenting everything, waiting to see if you would reform yourself. You haven't. So now we're going to present our evidence to Earth authorities and let them decide whether your colony retains its charter. The crowd erupted into chaos. Some people shouted support for Franklin's words. Others demanded answers from Gray. Security officers looked at each other uncertainly, unsure whether they should defend their administrator or stand down. The whole situation was spiraling beyond anyone's control. Helen Grant, the settlement's senior council member, pushed through the crowd. She was an older woman who had been part of the original colony mission, respected by almost everyone. She looked at the holographic evidence still floating in the air, then turned to Gray with disgust written on her face. Vincent, is this true? Did you send armed men after a 12-year-old boy? Gray's face showed panic now. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. It was a misunderstanding. The boy set fire to property. My men were simply trying to bring him back for questioning. Your men chased him 3 miles into dangerous forest with weapons drawn, Helen said coldly. That's not questioning. That's hunting. She turned to Franklin. On behalf of the Colonial Council, I apologize for our administrator's actions. We didn't know. If we had known, we would have stopped this months ago. Franklin nodded respectfully. We understand that many colonists are innocent of your administrator's crimes. That's why we're handling this publicly, rather than simply removing him ourselves. Your people deserve to know the truth and to choose their own path forward. Other council members were pushing through the crowd now, all of them looking at Gray with varying degrees of anger and betrayal. The administrator's power base was crumbling in real time. High above the forest floor, in a hidden observation station built seamlessly into the canopy of an ancient tree, 3 people watched the chase unfold on holographic displays that showed multiple angles of the scene below. The technology was far beyond anything the colonial settlement possessed, sleek and sophisticated in ways that seemed almost magical. Commander Lisa Webb leaned closer to one of the displays, her expression tight with concern. She was a woman in her 40s with silver streaking through her dark hair, and the bearing of someone accustomed to making difficult decisions. The child is cornered, she said quietly. Those men are going to harm him. Beside her, Scout Officer Henry Park tracked the 3 pursuers with his eyes, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. We should intervene. This violates every principle we stand for. We can't just watch a child be hurt when we have the power to stop it. The 3rd person in the observation station was Elder Franklin Hayes, the leader of the kindred people. He was in his 60s with deep lines around his eyes that spoke of wisdom earned through decades of leadership. His people had lived in the deep wood forest for 500 years, hidden from the universe, seeking nothing but peace after fleeing Earth's endless wars. He had maintained strict policies of non-intervention with the new colonists who arrived 70 years ago, believing that observation without contact was the wisest course. But now those policies were being tested in the worst possible way. Show me the background on this situation, Franklin said, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision he knew was coming. How did we get here? Henry manipulated the controls and brought up recordings from earlier in the day. They watched as Vincent Gray's men confronted the woman at her farm, as she raised her weapon in defense of her home, as smoke began pouring from the barn. They saw the boy run and the chase begin. The kindred had been monitoring the colonial settlement's edge for decades, their surveillance technology allowing them to observe without being detected. They had recorded everything. The woman is Margaret Chen, Lisa said, pulling up additional information. Her husband was killed 3 years ago defending the settlement. She's been struggling to maintain her farm alone with only her son to help her. The colonial administrator has been pressuring her to sell her land for months. This morning he sent enforcers to force the issue. And the boy set fire to the barn as a distraction, Henry added. He was trying to save his mother. Now those men are going to punish him for it. Franklin watched the displays showing Danny pressed against the cliff wall with 3 armed men approaching him. The boy's face showed terror and exhaustion. He was just a child, barely into his teenage years, and he had run for miles through dangerous forest to escape people who wanted to hurt him. The elder felt something twist in his chest, a pain that came from watching injustice unfold and having the power to stop it, but being bound by policies he himself had created. If we intervene, we reveal ourselves, Franklin said, not arguing but simply stating the reality. 500 years of secrecy will end. The consequences could be severe. Earth will learn that we're here. The colonial administration will have to be dealt with. Everything will change. And if we don't intervene? Lisa's voice was sharp. We watch a child be harmed, possibly killed, and we live with that weight on our souls. We live with the knowledge that we had the power to stop evil and chose not to, because it was inconvenient for us. Franklin looked at the other displays showing various parts of the kindred civilization. Their hidden city stretched through the trees for miles, home to 50,000 people who had built a society based on peace, environmental harmony, and the rejection of violence. They had sophisticated technology that they used to live in balance with nature, rather than conquering it. They had schools and hospitals and research centers, all cleverly disguised to be invisible from above and from the ground. They had art and music and literature, a culture that had flourished in isolation. But they had also lost something in their isolation. They had lost the willingness to stand against injustice when it happened in front of them. They had become so focused on their own peace that they forgot that peace sometimes requires action. 500 years ago, our ancestors fled Earth because they were tired of war. Franklin said slowly, they came here seeking a place where they could live without violence, without conflict, without the endless cycle of human cruelty. We've honored that dream by staying hidden, by avoiding contact with the new colonists, by maintaining our isolation. But perhaps we've taken it too far. Perhaps there's a difference between seeking peace and hiding from responsibility. He stood up and looked at both Lisa and Henry. Activate the peacekeepers. Full tactical deployment. We're going to bring that boy home to his mother. And we're going to have a conversation with the colonial administration about boundaries and consequences. It's time the colonists learned that they're not alone on this world. Lisa and Henry moved quickly to comply, their faces showing relief and determination. Commands went out through communication channels that the colonists didn't even know existed. Throughout the forest, kindred peacekeepers who had been watching the situation received orders to move in. They were trained professionals, equipped with technology that made them nearly invisible and weapons that could stun without killing. They had trained for decades for scenarios like this, even though many thought they would never actually use that training. On the forest floor, Danny pressed his back against the cliff wall and tried to make himself as small as possible. Carl, Pete, and Jake spread out to form a semicircle around him, cutting off any possible escape route. They were taking their time now, enjoying their victory, making the boy suffer with fear before they grabbed him. You caused us a lot of trouble, kid, Carl said, his voice cold. We had to abandon our hoverbikes. We've been walking for hours through this miserable forest. Mr. Gray is going to want compensation for all that inconvenience, and I think you're going to provide it. Danny tried to speak, but his voice came out as barely a whisper. Please, I just want to go home to my mother. You should have thought of that before you burned down property, Jake said, moving closer. Now you're going to learn what happens to people who stand in the way of progress. Pete raised his stunner, aiming it at Danny's chest. His finger began to squeeze the trigger. The journey back through the forest was unlike anything Danny had ever experienced. The kindred peacekeepers moved through the wilderness with easy confidence, following paths that Danny couldn't even see. They traveled on foot, but it felt effortless for them. They belonged to this forest in a way the colonists never had. Danny walked beside Elder Franklin Hayes, his hand occasionally touching the old man's arm for reassurance. The 3 captured enforcers walked in the middle of the group, surrounded by guards who never let their attention waver. As they traveled, Danny began to see things he had missed during his panicked run. The forest was not wild at all. It was carefully tended and shaped. Hidden among the natural growth were structures that blended so perfectly with their surroundings that you could stare right at them and not realize they were artificial. Bridges connected trees at various heights, so subtle in their design that they looked like natural branches. Platforms nestled in the canopy provided lookout points and living spaces. Lights glowed softly in hollows powered by technology Danny couldn't begin to understand. "You live here?" Danny asked, his voice filled with wonder. "In the forest?" Franklin nodded. "We've lived here for 500 years. When our ancestors fled Earth, they were tired of cities that conquered nature and technology that destroyed the environment. They wanted to build something different, so they came to New Haven and created a civilization that works with the forest instead of against it. Everything you see was grown as much as built. We shaped the trees over centuries, guiding their growth, creating homes within them. We use technology, but we use it to enhance nature rather than replace it." Lisa Webb walked on Danny's other side, occasionally scanning the area with devices built into her clothing. "We've been watching your settlement since it was established 70 years ago. We knew you were coming long before your colony ships arrived. We could have revealed ourselves then, but Elder Hayes and the Council decided that observation without contact was the wiser choice." "Why?" Danny asked. "Why hide from us?" Franklin's expression grew sad. "Because the last time humans made contact with each other in space, it ended in war. The war our ancestors fled from started over resources, over territory, over which group had the right to settle which worlds. We didn't want to risk that happening again. We thought that by staying hidden we could avoid conflict. Perhaps we were wrong. Perhaps isolation is its own kind of cowardice." They passed through a section of forest where Danny could see more evidence of the kindred civilization. Children played on platforms high in the trees, supervised by adults who watched them with patient attention. People worked in gardens that grew both on the forest floor and in carefully constructed beds among the branches. Everyone they passed stopped to stare at the strange procession. Their peacekeepers, the captured colonists, and the young boy from the settlement. Carl had been walking in sullen silence, but now he spoke up. "Gray won't let this stand. The colonial administration has authority over this entire planet. You can't just claim land that belongs to all humanity." Franklin stopped walking and turned to face Carl with an expression that made the big man take a step backward. "We claimed this land 500 years before your colony existed. We have legal documentation, filed with Earth's old colonial charter authority proving our settlement rights. Your administration either didn't bother to check the historical records or they checked and decided to ignore them. Either way, you are the trespassers, not us." Pete looked around nervously at the forest and the hidden city within it. "How many of you are there?" "Enough," was all Franklin said before resuming the walk. They descended from the deep forest gradually, moving through zones that showed decreasing signs of kindred habitation. Danny realized they were being very careful about how much they revealed even now. They showed him enough to prove they existed and to demonstrate their capability, but not enough to expose all their secrets. It was the caution of a people who had spent centuries hiding and knew that old habits died hard. Henry Park, one of the kindred scouts, dropped back to walk beside Franklin. He spoke quietly, but Danny could hear him. "The Council is not going to be happy about this. Revealing ourselves goes against 500 years of policy. The Council will understand that circumstances forced our hand," Franklin replied. "We could not stand by and watch a child be harmed. If they disagree with my decision, they can remove me from leadership. I'll accept that consequence." Lisa shook her head. "They won't remove you. Everyone knows this was the right choice. We should have revealed ourselves years ago, when the colonial administrator started using violence to expand his territory. We've been documenting his crimes for months, waiting for the right moment to act. This situation simply forced our timeline." As they got closer to the forest edge, Franklin explained more to Danny about his people. The kindred had originally been a fleet of refugee ships fleeing Earth's resource wars, conflicts that had consumed half the planet before finally burning themselves out. They were scientists, artists, farmers, and families who wanted no part of the fighting. They found New Haven by accident, a garden world far from any of the major shipping lanes or strategic locations that militaries fought over. They landed in the deep wood forest and began building their hidden civilization. They had the technology to remain undetected, and they used it. They developed their own culture, one based on environmental harmony and peaceful coexistence. They had no interest in conquest or expansion. The vast forest provided everything they needed. and they carefully managed its resources to ensure sustainability for future generations. When the colonial ships arrived 70 years ago and established the settlement on the plains, the kindred watched with interest and some concern. The new colonists seemed peaceful at first, simple farmers and pioneers looking for a fresh start. The kindred council debated whether to make contact, but ultimately decided to maintain their isolation. They would observe and only intervene if the colonists proved to be a threat. For decades, the policy worked. The settlement grew slowly, and the colonists showed no interest in the deep forest. The kindred continued their hidden life, and the colonists remained ignorant of their neighbors. But then Vincent Gray came to power as colonial administrator, and everything changed. Gray was ambitious and greedy. He pushed for rapid expansion, for exploitation of resources, for policies that enriched him and his allies while ordinary colonists struggled. "We've documented every crime he's committed," Lisa said. "Every bribe, every threat, every act of violence. We knew eventually we would have to act. We were just waiting for the right moment. And I gave you that moment," Danny said quietly, "by setting fire to the barn." Franklin put his hand on Danny's shoulder. "You gave us a catalyst, but the moment was coming regardless. Gray's ambitions would eventually have pushed him into the forest, and we would have had to reveal ourselves to stop him. You just accelerated the timeline. If anything, you may have prevented a worse confrontation down the road." Jake, who had been quiet for most of the journey, finally spoke up. His voice was subdued, stripped of the arrogance he'd shown earlier. "What's going to happen to us?" "That depends on your colonial administrator," Franklin answered. "We're going to return you to the settlement along with Danny. Then we're going to have a conversation with Gray about boundaries, consequences, and the future. If he's reasonable, perhaps we can establish peaceful coexistence. If he's not, well, we have contingencies for that as well." 3 weeks had passed since the kindred emerged from the forest, and the colonial settlement was still adjusting to its new reality. The change was profound and touched every aspect of life. Vincent Gray had been removed from his position within hours of Franklin's public revelation, arrested by his own security officers once the evidence of his crimes became undeniable. Carl Hudson, Pete Morrison, and Jake Sullivan faced charges of assault and attempted harm against a minor. The Colonial Council, now led by Helen Grant, had opened a full investigation into corruption within the administration. But the most significant change was the relationship between the colony and the kindred. After 500 years of hiding, the forest people had stepped into the light, and both civilizations were learning to navigate this new dynamic. It was not always smooth. There was fear on both sides, mistrust built from decades of ignorance and isolation. But there was also hope, and a genuine desire from most people on both sides to make coexistence work. Elder Franklin Hayes sat in what had once been Gray's office but was now a neutral meeting space where representatives from both communities could talk. Across the table from him sat Helen Grant and 4 other Colonial Council members. They had been meeting every day for the past 3 weeks, hammering out the details of a treaty that would define the relationship between their peoples going forward. "The boundary is acceptable," Helen said, studying the maps spread across the table. "We agree that the deep wood forest and the entire western continent belong to the kindred. Colonial expansion will be limited to the eastern plains and coastal regions. We'll establish a buffer zone here, 3 miles wide, where neither group can build permanent structures without joint approval." Franklin nodded. "That's fair. We also need to discuss environmental protections. The logging operations that Gray authorized caused significant damage. We want assurances that future resource extraction will be sustainable and properly regulated." Helen looked embarrassed. "We'll shut down the unauthorized logging immediately and implement strict environmental review processes. The kindred will have veto power over any projects that might impact the forest ecosystem." Lisa Webb, who sat beside Franklin as the kindred's chief negotiator, added another point. "We also want joint patrols in the buffer zone. Our peacekeepers and your security forces working together to prevent boundary violations and respond to emergencies. It will help build trust between our peoples." The Colonial Council members looked at each other, then nodded in agreement. This was exactly the kind of cooperation they needed. The treaty was taking shape, built on mutual respect rather than dominance. It helped that the kindred had demonstrated both their technological superiority and their restraint. They could have destroyed the colonial settlement if they wanted to, Instead, they chose negotiation and offered to share knowledge that would benefit both communities. We're also prepared to offer limited technology transfer, Franklin said. Medical advances that could extend your people's lives and improve health outcomes. Agricultural techniques that will help your crops thrive in New Haven's soil. Communication systems that will let us coordinate more effectively. We're not trying to make you dependent on us. We're trying to help you succeed while respecting your independence. Helen smiled, the first genuine smile Franklin had seen from her in days of tense negotiations. That's generous. We accept with the understanding that any technology transfer will be transparent and come with full training for our people. They talked for another hour, working through details about trade, cultural exchange, and dispute resolution. By the end of the meeting, they had the framework of a comprehensive treaty that would govern relations between the kindred and the colony for generations to come. It would need to be ratified by both the Colonial Council and the Kindred Assembly, but Franklin was confident it would pass. Both peoples were tired of conflict and eager for the benefits that cooperation could bring. As the meeting ended and people filed out, Helen stayed behind to speak with Franklin privately. Thank you for how you've handled this. You could have been vindictive after what Gray and his men did. Instead, you've been fair and even generous. Franklin shook his head. We're all human, Helen. We're all descendants of people who left Earth seeking better lives. The fact that we arrived at different times doesn't make us enemies. Besides, my people have been isolated for too long. Perhaps it's time we rejoined the broader human community. Outside the administration building, life in the settlement continued with a new energy. Colonists who had felt oppressed under Gray's rule were speaking freely now, proposing new ideas and challenging old assumptions. There was a sense that anything was possible, that the revelation of the kindred had opened doors that nobody even knew existed. At Margaret Chen's farm, reconstruction was underway. The barn had been destroyed by the fire Danny set, but the kindred had sent workers with advanced materials and construction techniques. The new barn was rising faster than anyone thought possible, built to last for generations and equipped with environmental controls that would protect the stored grain and feed. Margaret watched the construction with amazement, still struggling to process everything that had happened. Danny sat on the fence nearby, watching people work. Elder Franklin had visited several times over the past weeks, checking on the boy and bringing gifts of food and supplies. The kindred leader seemed to have taken a personal interest in Danny's welfare, perhaps because the boy's courage and sacrifice had been the catalyst for everything that followed. A shadow fell across Danny, and he looked up to see Franklin approaching with Henry Park beside him. The kindred scout carried a backpack that looked like it was made from living wood, its surface shifting subtly in the light. "How are you doing, Danny?" Franklin asked, settling onto the fence beside the boy. "I'm okay. Still have nightmares sometimes about running through the forest, but Mama says that's normal and they'll fade with time." Franklin nodded understandingly. Fear leaves marks on us even after the danger has passed. But so does courage, and you showed great courage that day. Henry set the backpack down and opened it, revealing books and learning tablets inside. "We brought you something. Elder Hayes thought you might be interested in learning about the kindred, about our history and our relationship with the forest. These are primers, written for young people who want to understand." Danny's eyes lit up with interest. "Really? I can learn about your people?" "Not just learn about them," Franklin said with a smile. "We'd like to offer you something more. With your mother's permission, of course. We have schools in the forest, places where young people study ecology, biology, and the art of living in harmony with nature. You have a natural affinity for the wilderness, Danny. We saw how you moved through the forest even when you were frightened and exhausted. You have instincts that can't be taught, only refined." He paused, making sure Danny understood the importance of what he was about to say. "We'd like to offer you a place in our youth program. You would split your time between here and the forest, learning from our teachers while still maintaining your connection to your mother and the colonial community. In time, if you choose, you could become a bridge between our peoples. Someone who understands both civilizations and can help us communicate and cooperate." Danny looked at his mother, who had stopped watching the construction and was now listening intently. Margaret walked over and stood behind her son, her hands on his shoulders. "What do you think, Danny?" Margaret asked. "Is this something you want to do?" Danny thought about the strange and beautiful things he had seen during his brief time in the deep forest. He thought about the kindred people who had saved him when Gray's men wanted to hurt him. He thought about the possibility of learning secrets that no other colonist would know, of becoming someone who could help both groups understand each other. "I want to do it," Danny said firmly. "I want to learn about the forest and help our peoples work together." Margaret smiled and squeezed his shoulders. "Then you have my permission. But you're coming home every week for dinner, no exceptions." Franklin laughed, a warm sound that made everyone feel at ease. "That's completely acceptable. Family is important to the kindred, too. We'll make sure Danny maintains his connections here even as he builds new ones in the forest." Over the following months, the integration between the two communities progressed steadily. Trade began to flow, with colonists offering manufactured goods and food crops in exchange for kindred medicines and refined materials. Cultural exchanges brought kindred artists to perform in the settlement, and colonial musicians to play in the forest. The initial fear and suspicion faded as people on both sides realized they had more in common than they had differences. Danny Chen became a symbol of this new relationship. He studied with kindred teachers, learning about ecology and sustainable living. He learned to move through the forest with the same ease as someone born to it, understanding the subtle signs and signals that the wilderness provided. But he also kept his connections to the colony, bringing what he learned back to share with other young colonists who were curious about their neighbors. The kindred remained mysterious to most colonists, still keeping many.